When an elderly woman passes away and doesn't leave a will, her greedy daughter does the unthinkable. Eleanor Wilcox's life was a quiet but meaningful one. She had spent her years tending to her garden, baking for the church charity drives, and hosting simple but heartfelt dinners for friends and neighbors. In the small town of Millhaven, everyone knew Eleanor. Her modest house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and overflowing flower beds, was as much a part of the community as the town square. When the news of her passing spread, it felt as though a part of the town's heart had been torn away. People gathered at the small church, where Eleanor had been a steadfast presence, whispering about her kind deeds and the way she always had a smile for everyone. The local newspaper ran a tribute to her, calling her Millhaven's gentle soul. But the mourning soon gave way to an uneasy curiosity. Eleanor had been widowed for decades, and her only daughter Meredith had left town years ago. Eleanor had always hinted at her plans for her modest savings and her house. Most believed she would leave it to the local library or donate it to the church. After all, she had often spoken of wanting to support the community that had given her so much joy. When Agnes Brown, Eleanor's closest friend and neighbor for over 30 years, spoke with the attorney handling Eleanor's affairs, the news came as a shock. There was no will. The revelation sent ripples of surprise through the community. Eleanor had always seemed so organized and thoughtful. How could she have left such an important matter undone? People speculated endlessly. Some wondered if she had simply forgotten, her memory perhaps faltering in her later years. Others believed there might have been a will, but it had been lost or misplaced. Eleanor's home, though modest, was valuable, and her savings, while not vast, were enough to pique the interest of anyone who might have a claim. Without a will, the law dictated that her next of kin would inherit everything. That's when the whispers began about Meredith Wilcox, Eleanor's estranged daughter. Few in Millhaven knew much about her. Meredith had left town decades ago, estranging herself from her mother in pursuit of a glamorous life in the city. Some said she had married into wealth, while others believed she had burned through her opportunities and ended up struggling. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Meredith had been absent from Eleanor's life for years. Agnes and the rest of the community were troubled. They had seen firsthand how much Eleanor cared for the town, and the idea of her assets being inherited by someone who had all but abandoned her didn't sit well with them. As days turned into weeks, the town buzzed with rumors about what might happen. Would Meredith return? Did she even know her mother had passed? Some neighbors, while mourning Eleanor, couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, Eleanor's house sat eerily quiet. The once lively home, filled with the scent of freshly baked pies and the sound of soft humming as Eleanor tended to her plants, now felt cold and abandoned. Agnes found herself glancing over at the house every morning, her heart heavy with both grief and worry. One afternoon, as Agnes watered the begonias along her own fence line, a sleek black car rolled down the gravel road toward Eleanor's house. The car, with its dark windows and glossy exterior, stood out starkly in the quaint, humble neighborhood. Agnes froze, her watering can dangling from her hand. The car came to a stop, and the door swung open. Meredith had returned. She stepped out in a tailored coat and high heels, her sunglasses shielding her eyes. Her striking presence was a sharp contrast to the warm, approachable woman the town remembered in Eleanor. Meredith surveyed the house for a moment before walking briskly to the front door, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Agnes, watching from her garden, felt a knot of unease tighten in her chest. She couldn't help but feel that Meredith's arrival marked the beginning of something troubling. Inside the house, Meredith began sorting through her mother's belongings, her movements brisk and efficient. She showed no outward sign of mourning, no lingering pause as she passed the family photos on the mantel or the handwritten recipe cards tucked in a drawer. To Meredith, it seemed, the house was just another piece of unfinished business. Word spread quickly through Millhaven. People speculated about her intentions, some hopeful that she might honor her mother's wishes and give back to the community, others skeptical, noting her history of selfishness. As night fell, Meredith sat alone in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine in hand. The house felt suffocatingly quiet, She stared at the shadows dancing on the walls, the weight of her mother's absence pressing down on her. But any flicker of vulnerability was quickly masked. She had come back for a reason, and she wouldn't leave empty-handed. The next morning, Meredith made a call to the attorney. "No will," she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. "No will," the attorney confirmed. "As Eleanor's only child, the estate will default to you, unless, of course, there are disputes or claims brought forward." Meredith's lips curved into a faint smile. She hadn't expected it to be this easy. But while Meredith began to plan her next moves, the town of Millhaven watched with quiet vigilance. And in the hearts of those who loved Eleanor, a determination began to grow, determination to ensure her legacy wasn't tarnished, even if it meant challenging Meredith Wilcox. As the story unfolded, one thing was certain. Eleanor's passing had set the stage for a conflict that would test the strength of old friendships, reveal hidden truths, and ultimately force everyone, including Meredith, to confront the unthinkable. Meredith Wilcox's arrival in Millhaven was anything but subtle. Her black car, a sharp contrast to the town's modest charm, parked squarely in front of her late mother's house. The sleek, expensive vehicle stood as a glaring reminder of how far removed Meredith had become from the quiet, community-focused life Eleanor cherished. She stepped out with an air of authority, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached the house. Meredith's tailored coat and perfectly styled hair screamed sophistication, but the tight line of her lips and the guarded look in her eyes betrayed an edge of impatience. This wasn't a visit born of sentimentality. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet speculation. Behind curtains and over garden fences, the people of Millhaven watched as Meredith entered Eleanor's house for the first time in years. She hadn't attended her mother's funeral, citing unavoidable commitments, which had already soured the town's opinion of her. Now her sudden arrival felt less like a grieving daughter returning to pay respects, and more like a businesswoman coming to settle accounts. Meredith pushed open the door, its familiar creak echoing through the silent house. The air inside was heavy with stillness, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy Eleanor had always brought. The scent of lavender, Eleanor's favorite, still lingered faintly, mingling with the mustiness of a home that had been left untouched since her passing. For a moment, Meredith stood in the entryway, her gaze sweeping over the space. The furniture, worn but well cared for, the crocheted doilies on the armrests, the shelves lined with books and trinkets, all spoke of a life far removed from her own. She felt a flicker of something guilt, perhaps, but quickly brushed it aside. Sentimentality had no place in her plans. She wasted no time getting to work. Opening drawers, rifling through papers, and scanning shelves, she sought anything of value. Her movements were methodical, efficient. The town might have remembered her as charming once, a golden-haired teenager with a bright smile and big dreams, but that version of Meredith had long since vanished. Life had hardened her, and now she operated with a single-minded focus, securing what she believed was rightfully hers. The house yielded little in the way of surprises. A modest collection of jewelry, a few antique pieces, and Eleanor's savings account statements were among the items Meredith set aside. She scowled as she added up the numbers in her head. It wasn't as much as she'd hoped, but it was still something. Later that day, she made her way to the attorney handling her mother's estate. The meeting was brief. When the attorney confirmed that there was no will, Meredith's expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction. "So, that makes me the sole heir?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," the attorney replied, his tone neutral but his gaze sharp. "As Eleanor's only immediate family member, everything will default to you, unless a valid will is found or someone contests the inheritance." Meredith nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. Perfect. Back in Millhaven, word of Meredith's claim spread quickly. The townspeople, many of whom had expected Eleanor's estate to benefit the community in some way, were disheartened. They had seen firsthand how much Eleanor cared for the town, always finding ways to give back despite her limited means. The thought of Meredith, who had been absent for so long, swooping in to take everything felt like a betrayal of Eleanor's legacy. Agnes Brown, Eleanor's closest friend, was particularly incensed. Sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, she replayed every conversation she'd ever had with Eleanor about her wishes. While Eleanor had never explicitly said she was leaving her estate to the town, her actions and values had made it clear where her heart lay. Agnes decided to pay Meredith a visit. It wasn't a decision she took lightly, but she couldn't sit by and do nothing. She found Meredith at the house, seated at the dining table with papers spread before her. Meredith greeted Agnes with polite disinterest, offering her a seat as though she were a stranger rather than someone who had shared decades of friendship with her mother. "I just wanted to stop by," Agnes began, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "To see how you're settling in." Meredith raised an eyebrow. "It's fine," she said coolly. "I'm just organizing everything. It's a lot to manage." "I imagine so," Agnes replied. "Eleanor was very proud of this house, you know, and of this town. She always said she wanted to leave something behind that would make a difference." Meredith's expression didn't waver. "Well, she didn't leave a will, so I'll be deciding how to handle things. But don't worry, I'll make sure everything is taken care of." The words were dismissive, almost condescending, and they stung. Agnes realized then that appealing to Meredith's sense of decency might be a lost cause. As she left the house, her heart ached not just for Eleanor's memory, but for the fight that she feared was coming. Meanwhile, Meredith continued her work, undeterred by the whispers and judgment of the townspeople. She considered selling the house and liquidating the assets, thinking only of the financial gain. The sentimental value of Eleanor's possessions meant nothing to her. They were merely obstacles in the way of her goals. Yet, even as she planned, there were moments when Meredith felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. Late at night, the silence seemed to amplify the memories embedded in the walls. She avoided looking too long at the family photos or lingering in the garden where her mother had spent so much time. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the house seemed to hum with Eleanor's presence, a quiet reminder of everything Meredith had turned away from. Unbeknownst to her, Millhaven wasn't ready to let Eleanor's legacy fade quietly. Agnes and others began to talk, their frustration giving way to determination. They didn't know what they could do yet, but they knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't let Meredith erase the spirit of the woman who had given so much to their town. As Meredith pressed forward with her plans, the stage was set for a battle that would test the strength of old loyalties and reveal truths that had long been buried. For Meredith, the path ahead seemed clear, but the choices she made would soon force her to confront more than just her mother's estate. They would force her to confront herself. The air in Millhaven was thick with unease. Meredith's sudden arrival and swift claim over Eleanor's estate had left a sour taste in the mouths of many. Eleanor had been more than just a neighbor or a friend. She was a cornerstone of the community. Her warmth, generosity, and unwavering kindness had touched everyone in town. To see her legacy so quickly overshadowed by her estranged daughter's calculating demeanor felt like a betrayal. Agnes Brown sat in her small kitchen, staring at the photograph of herself and Eleanor taken last summer. They were seated in Eleanor's garden, laughing over a tray of tea and scones. The memory was a sharp contrast to the cold, businesslike approach Meredith had brought to the house. "I don't like it," Agnes said, her voice firm as she poured a cup of tea for Mr. Holloway, the town's retired lawyer and one of Eleanor's oldest friends. He had stopped by after hearing the murmurs around town. "Neither do I," he replied, taking a careful sip. "But without a will, there's not much anyone can do. The law is clear. Meredith is the next of kin." "That may be so," Agnes countered, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her teacup. "But something about this doesn't sit right with me. She didn't even come to the funeral, John, and now she's here, rifling through Eleanor's things like a vulture." Holloway nodded, his brows furrowed in thought. "I've been hearing things," he said cautiously. "Rumors about Meredith's life back in the city, debt collectors, failed business ventures. It seems she's in more financial trouble than she'd like to admit." Agnes's eyes widened. "Do you think she came back because of that? Because she needs the money?" "It's possible," Mr. Holloway admitted, "but if that's the case, it raises an important question. Just how far would she go to get her hands on it?" The two sat in silence, the implications of Mr. Holloway's words hanging heavy in the air. Over the next few days, the small town of Millhaven buzzed with quiet activity. Agnes and Mr. Holloway weren't the only ones who felt uneasy about Meredith's return. Eleanor's other friends and neighbors began to share their observations, piecing together a troubling picture of her daughter's behavior. Tom, the owner of the local hardware store, mentioned how Meredith had stopped by to ask about selling off Eleanor's gardening tools and furniture. She didn't care about their sentimental value, he told Agnes one afternoon. Just wanted to know how much she could get for them. Mrs. Carter, who ran the bakery, recounted how Meredith had turned up late one evening, demanding the deed to the house. I told her I didn't know anything about it, she said, but the way she spoke like she was entitled to everything Eleanor ever touched, it was unsettling. These conversations only strengthened Agnes's resolve. If Meredith thought she could sweep into town and take everything Eleanor had worked so hard for, she was sorely mistaken. Mr. Holloway, ever the meticulous investigator, began digging into Meredith's past. It wasn't long before he uncovered some troubling details. Meredith had once been a rising star in the real estate world, known for her charm and ambition. But her career had taken a steep downturn after several failed ventures. Lawsuits, unpaid debts, and rumors of shady dealings painted a picture of someone desperate to climb back to the top no matter the cost. Agnes's concern deepened as she and Mr. Holloway shared their findings with a small group of trusted neighbors. They debated what to do next. Could they challenge Meredith's claim to the estate? Was there any way to ensure Eleanor's legacy was protected? Meanwhile, Meredith remained largely oblivious to the undercurrent of resistance brewing around her. She continued her work, cataloging Eleanor's belongings and making plans to liquidate as much as possible. To her, the house and its contents were nothing more than assets waiting to be converted into cash, but cracks began to show in her polished facade. One evening, as she sorted through a box of old letters in Eleanor's study, Meredith came across a stack of photographs. There she was as a little girl, sitting on Eleanor's lap with a broad smile on her face. Another photo showed the two of them baking in the kitchen, flour dusting their noses. For a moment, the image stirred something deep within her, nostalgia, perhaps, or regret. But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. Sentimentality wouldn't pay off her debts. The tension between Meredith and the community came to a head during a chance encounter at the local diner. Agnes, accompanied by Mr. Holloway, approached Meredith's table. "You're making quite the impression around town," Agnes said, her tone measured but firm. Meredith raised an eyebrow. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied. "This house and everything in it belong to me now." Agnes leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Eleanor didn't raise you to be this way, Meredith. She deserved better than this." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Meredith's eyes, shame, perhaps, or anger, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. "You don't know anything about me or my relationship with my mother," she said sharply. "And frankly, it's none of your business." The confrontation left Agnes shaken, but more determined than ever. Meredith might hold the legal claim to Eleanor's estate, but the community wouldn't let her erase the memory of the woman who had given so much to Millhaven. Back at the house, Meredith began to feel the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. The whispers, the judgmental glances, and the unspoken accusations from the townspeople were starting to take their toll. But even as doubt crept in, her greed and desperation kept her moving forward. She had come too far to turn back now. Unbeknownst to Meredith, Agnes and Mr. Holloway were quietly laying the groundwork for their next move. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to honor Eleanor's legacy and ensure that her memory wasn't tarnished by her daughter's actions. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one thing became clear. The battle for Eleanor's estate was far from over, and the truth about Meredith's intentions was about to come to light. The pressure had been building for days. Meredith's mounting debts, the judgmental whispers from the townspeople, and the ghost of her mother's disapproving gaze seemed to haunt her at every turn. Desperation clawed at her, sharpening her resolve to do whatever was necessary to secure her inheritance. She needed that money not just for the creditors breathing down her neck, but to salvage the image of herself she clung to, a woman who could still win, no matter the cost. Late one night, as the town of Millhaven slept under a blanket of stars, Meredith sat alone in Eleanor's study. The dim light from the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, its warm glow falling on stacks of Eleanor's letters, journals, and financial records. Meredith's eyes darted between the papers and the blank sheet of parchment in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen, but she forced herself to steady them. "This is the only way," she whispered to herself, her voice hollow. Drawing on her childhood memories of her mother's handwriting, Meredith began to forge a will. She wrote slowly, mimicking Eleanor's neat, deliberate penmanship. The document was simple and straightforward. It named Meredith as the sole heir to the estate, citing her as the only family Eleanor had left. She even added a line about Eleanor's deep love for her daughter, a lie so cruel and calculated it sent a shiver down her spine. To make the will appear authentic, Meredith dug through Eleanor's belongings for details she could weave into the narrative. She found an old journal entry where Eleanor had written about wanting to leave something for Meredith, even though they had grown apart. The words, taken out of context, became a justification for her scheme. She also discovered Eleanor's signature on several letters, carefully studying the loops and flourishes before adding it to the forged will. When she was finished, Meredith leaned back in the chair and stared at the document. It looked convincing. The paper was aged, the ink slightly faded, but even as she admired her handiwork, a pang of guilt twisted in her chest. She shook it off, reminding herself that this was survival. Her mother's kindness had never paid her bills, and the townspeople's opinions wouldn't save her from the collectors. This was her birthright, she told herself. She was just taking what should have been hers all along. The next morning, Meredith took the forged will to the local courthouse. She presented it to the probate officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a penchant for small-town gossip. Meredith put on her best performance, weaving a story about finding the document tucked away in an old chest in Eleanor's attic. "She always said she wanted me to have everything," Meredith said, feigning a tearful smile. "I think she must have written this shortly before she passed." The probate officer inspected the will, nodding occasionally as he read. "It's unusual for a will like this to surface so late," he said, glancing at Meredith. "But everything seems to be in order. We'll need to verify the handwriting, of course." Meredith's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. "Of course," she replied. "Take all the time you need." As she left the courthouse, a wave of relief washed over her. For the first time since her arrival in Millhaven, she felt like she was in control. The will would hold up, she told herself. The probate process was just a formality. News of the will spread quickly through the town, further souring the community's opinion of Meredith. Agnes, who had been quietly keeping tabs on Meredith's actions, immediately suspected foul play. She shared her concerns with Mr. Holloway, who was equally skeptical. "A will conveniently appearing after all this time?" Mr. Holloway said, pacing his living room. "And it just so happens to name Meredith as the sole heir? It's too perfect." "We need proof," Agnes said. "Something that shows she's lying." Holloway nodded, already forming a plan. "We'll start with the handwriting. If she forged it, there's bound to be inconsistencies." Meanwhile, Meredith reveled in her apparent victory. She began making plans to sell the house and liquidate Eleanor's assets. She hired an appraiser to evaluate the property, and her phone buzzed constantly with calls from prospective buyers. Her confidence grew with each passing day, and she allowed herself to believe she had outsmarted everyone. But her growing arrogance blinded her to the storm brewing around her. Agnes and Mr. Holloway, with the help of a few trusted friends, began quietly gathering evidence. They scoured Eleanor's old letters, journals, and even receipts, comparing her handwriting to the newly discovered will. They also spoke with the probate officer, raising questions about the document's authenticity. As the days went by, cracks began to form in Meredith's plan. The appraiser, a meticulous man named Walter, noticed something odd during his inspection of the house. In the attic, he found a pile of Eleanor's belongings that appeared untouched for years. Among them was an old chest, its lock rusted shut. "This doesn't look like it's been opened recently," Walter said, frowning. "Strange, considering Meredith said she found the will in here." His comment made its way back to Agnes, who saw it as the first real piece of evidence against Meredith. She shared it with Mr. Holloway, who saw an opportunity to challenge the will in court. Meredith, oblivious to the mounting suspicion, continued her preparations as if her victory was assured. But the townspeople, once silent in their disapproval, began to voice their concerns more openly. The whispers of doubt grew louder, and Meredith found herself increasingly isolated. Still, she pressed on, convinced that her scheme would succeed. What she didn't realize was that her unthinkable act had set a chain of events in motion that would soon unravel everything she had worked for and expose her for who she truly was. The sense of unease around Meredith's sudden claim to Eleanor's estate had only deepened as the days passed. While the townspeople murmured among themselves, two individuals were quietly turning suspicion into action: Agnes, Eleanor's loyal neighbor, and Mr. Holloway, her trusted friend and lawyer. Both had known Eleanor well enough to feel that something about Meredith's story simply didn't add up. Agnes was the first to point out a glaring inconsistency. "Eleanor and I used to talk all the time about her plans for the house after she was gone," she told Mr. Holloway over tea one afternoon. "She always said she wanted it to become a home for those in need, a place for women and children who didn't have anywhere else to go. Does that sound like someone who'd leave everything to her daughter without a mention of charity?" Mr. Holloway agreed. He had drafted documents for Eleanor over the years, though she had never formalized a will. Still, her intentions were clear. She spoke often about leaving her estate to the Millhaven Women's Refuge, he said, flipping through his old notes. It's strange that her wishes would change so drastically. Their conversation spurred them into action. Mr. Holloway decided to dig into the supposed will, which the probate office had already begun to process. With his connections and legal expertise, he requested access to the document under the guise of routine verification. What he found left him deeply uneasy. "The handwriting is close, but it's not exact," he said to Agnes later that day, showing her a copy of the will alongside one of Eleanor's letters. "Look at the loops on the L's. They're tighter on the will than in her usual writing, and the signature, it's off, just slightly." Agnes squinted at the comparison, her stomach sinking. "Do you think she forged it?" Mr. Holloway hesitated. "It's not enough to prove anything yet, but it's a start." Word of their investigation spread quietly through the community, and others began to share their doubts. One neighbor, who had always been fond of Eleanor, mentioned overhearing Meredith on the phone, discussing how quickly she could sell the house. "It's like she doesn't care about Eleanor at all," the neighbor said. "She's treating it like a transaction." Another resident recalled an encounter with Meredith at the local market. She was asking about property values and buyers, they said. Not a word about her mother, just business. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together, and the picture they formed was not a flattering one. Meredith's behavior, her hurried plans to liquidate the estate, and the discrepancies in the will painted a troubling picture. Agnes and Mr. Holloway decided to dig deeper into Meredith's background, hoping to find something that would explain her motives. What they uncovered was shocking but unsurprising. Meredith was deeply in debt. Years of failed business ventures, reckless spending, and mounting loans had left her financially desperate. It was clear now why she had returned to Millhaven after years of estrangements. She saw her mother's estate as her last lifeline. Meanwhile, Meredith was becoming increasingly uneasy. She noticed the way people looked at her when she walked through town, their polite smiles replaced by tight-lipped stares. At the bakery, the cashier barely made small talk anymore, and at the post office, someone muttered under their breath as she passed. She shrugged it off at first, attributing it to the town's nosy nature, but the tension was undeniable. Her unease turned to anger when she overheard a conversation between two townspeople at the general store. "She's lying," one of them said in a hushed tone. "That will isn't real. You mark my words." Meredith slammed her basket on the counter and left without buying a thing. That evening, Mr. Holloway made a bold decision. He contacted a handwriting expert to analyze the will, using Eleanor's old letters and journals as a baseline. If the expert confirmed their suspicions, they would have concrete evidence to challenge the document's validity. While waiting for the results, Agnes and Mr. Holloway worked to rally the community. They reached out to the board members of the Millhaven Women's Refuge, sharing their findings and Eleanor's original wishes. The board members, many of whom had known Eleanor personally, were appalled by the idea that her estate might be taken under false pretenses. "This isn't just about money," Agnes said passionately during one meeting. "This is about honoring Eleanor's legacy. She gave so much to this community. We can't let her memory be tarnished by greed." The community began to mobilize. Letters were written to the probate office, urging a thorough investigation. A petition circulated, gathering signatures to ensure Eleanor's estate would be used for the greater good, as she had intended. Even those who had initially hesitated to get involved found themselves swept up in the growing tide of resistance against Meredith's claim. For Meredith, the walls seemed to be closing in. Her confident facade began to crack as the scrutiny intensified. She avoided town as much as possible, retreating to Eleanor's house, where the silence was both a refuge and a torment. She tried to convince herself that she would get away with it, that no one could prove anything. But the doubt gnawed at her, an ever-present shadow in the dimly lit rooms. The breaking point came when she received a call from the probate officer, requesting her presence for a follow-up meeting. Meredith's hands shook as she set the phone down, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast if she wanted to maintain her grip on Eleanor's estate. But what Meredith didn't realize was that her web of lies was unraveling faster than she could spin it back together. And the community she had underestimated was about to deliver a blow she wouldn't see coming. The day of the confrontation arrived with a tension that seemed to grip the entire town. Agnes and Mr. Holloway, armed with their evidence, prepared themselves for what they knew would be an emotional and volatile encounter. The handwriting expert had confirmed their suspicions. The will was a forgery. With this information, they felt confident enough to face Meredith directly. Meredith, however, was less prepared. The call from Mr. Holloway requesting a meeting at Eleanor's house had left her uneasy. Still, she convinced herself that her act would hold up under scrutiny. As she paced the living room, the familiar surroundings of her mother's home now felt oppressive. Each creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind seemed to taunt her. When Agnes and Mr. Holloway arrived, Meredith greeted them with forced politeness, her smile thin and brittle. The tension in the room was palpable as they took their seats. Meredith sat on the worn couch, while Agnes and Mr. Holloway positioned themselves in the armchairs across from her, their expressions resolute. Mr. Holloway began with a measured tone, though his words carried weight. "Meredith, we need to discuss the will you submitted to the probate office. There are some inconsistencies that we can't ignore." Meredith's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, her voice a little too sharp. "It's perfectly legitimate." Agnes leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Meredith. "We had the handwriting analyzed, Meredith. It doesn't match Eleanor's, not exactly. The expert confirmed it." Meredith's face flushed with anger. "Are you accusing me of something? This is outrageous. Of course, it's her handwriting. I was her daughter, for heaven's sake. I know what her writing looks like better than anyone." Holloway maintained his calm demeanor. "We're not accusing you, Meredith. We're presenting facts. The will doesn't align with your mother's known handwriting, and that raises questions that the probate office will need answers to." Meredith's composure began to crack. She stood abruptly, pacing the room with frantic energy. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're all just bitter that I'm the one who got the inheritance. Maybe you should focus on your own lives instead of meddling in mine." Agnes didn't waver. "This isn't about us, Meredith. It's about Eleanor. She was a kind and generous woman who deserved better than this." "Better than what?" Meredith shot back, her voice rising. "She was my mother. I'm entitled to what she left behind. You don't know what it was like for me, growing up with nothing, watching her scrape by. Maybe I deserve this more than anyone." The rawness in Meredith's voice gave Agnes pause, but only for a moment. "Eleanor wanted to leave her estate to the Millhaven Women's Refuge," Agnes said softly. "She told me that herself. This house was meant to help people, Meredith, not to line someone's pockets." Meredith whirled around, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "She didn't leave a will, did she? So how do you know what she wanted? How can any of you claim to know?" Mr. Holloway spoke again, his voice firm but not unkind. "Because Eleanor was consistent in her actions and her words. She may not have written a formal will, but she was clear about her intentions to everyone who knew her. That's why we filed a formal challenge to the will you submitted. It's up to the courts now." Meredith froze, the weight of Mr. Holloway's statement sinking in. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Then Meredith's shoulders slumped, and she sank back onto the couch. "You don't understand," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I had no choice. I'm drowning in debt. The creditors are closing in. I thought this was my chance to fix everything." Agnes's expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "You had a choice, Meredith. You always have a choice. This wasn't the way." The legal process moved swiftly after that confrontation. The handwriting expert's report, combined with witness statements from the community and evidence of Meredith's financial troubles, formed a compelling case against her. The probate office put the processing of the will on hold pending a full investigation, and the local court soon got involved. As the case unfolded, Meredith's true nature was exposed to the town. Stories of her manipulative tendencies and estranged relationships came to light, painting a picture of a woman who had long struggled with selfishness and greed. Some townspeople felt pity for her, recognizing the desperation that had driven her actions, but most were appalled by her betrayal of Eleanor's memory. Meredith's behavior only further alienated her from the community. She avoided the town square entirely, refusing to face the people who once admired her mother. Alone in Eleanor's house, she grappled with the reality of her situation. Her scheme had unraveled, and with it, any hope of salvaging her reputation. Meanwhile, the community rallied together to protect Eleanor's legacy. Donations poured into the Millhaven Women's Refuge in Eleanor's name, and plans were set in motion to honor her wishes, regardless of the outcome of the legal battle. Agnes and Mr. Holloway became local heroes, their unwavering dedication to the truth inspiring others to stand up for what was right. For Meredith, the confrontation marked the beginning of a painful reckoning, and for the town of Millhaven, it served as a reminder of the values Eleanor had always embodied: honesty, kindness, and a commitment to helping others. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict. The air was thick with anticipation, every creak of the wooden benches amplified in the hushed room. Meredith sat rigidly in her seat, her face pale and devoid of its usual bravado. Across the aisle, Agnes and Mr. Holloway exchanged hopeful glances, their resolve finally culminating in this moment of truth. "The court finds that the will submitted by Meredith Wilcox is fraudulent," the judge declared, her voice steady and clear. "The evidence presented overwhelmingly supports the claim that this document was forged. As such, it is hereby invalidated." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Meredith's shoulders slumped, and for the first time her defiant facade cracked. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something, but she barely reacted. The weight of her actions was finally pressing down on her. The judge continued, "Given Eleanor Wilcox's well-documented verbal declarations regarding her estate, this court rules in favor of honoring her expressed wishes. The entirety of her assets, including her home and savings, will be transferred to the Millhaven Women's Refuge." A wave of relief washed over Agnes and Mr. Holloway. The years of Eleanor's kindness and generosity would not be tarnished by deception. Justice had prevailed. For Meredith, however, the verdict marked the beginning of a harsh reckoning. Outside the courthouse, reporters and townspeople gathered, their eyes trained on her as she exited the building. The whispers of greedy and shameless followed her like a shadow. No longer the polished and ambitious woman she once pretended to be, Meredith had become a symbol of betrayal in a town that once revered her mother. The legal consequences of her forgery were swift. Meredith faced charges for fraud and was sentenced to community service along with mandatory financial counseling. The court's decision stripped her of any claim to her mother's estate, leaving her with no safety net. Her mounting debts, once masked by a veneer of confidence, now loomed larger than ever. Forced to downsize her lifestyle, Meredith rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the house she once coveted. She found a job at a local diner, a far cry from the high-profile career she once envisioned for herself. Each day was a humbling reminder of the choices that had brought her here. In the weeks following the verdict, Meredith avoided the town square entirely, She couldn't bear the judgmental stares or the knowing looks from people who had once been kind to her mother. The loneliness was suffocating, but it forced her to confront the person she had become. Late at night, in the quiet of her small apartment, she replayed the events in her mind, grappling with the damage she had caused, not just to herself, but to her mother's legacy and the community Eleanor had cherished. The Millhaven Women's Refuge, now bolstered by Eleanor's generous bequest, became a beacon of hope for those in need. The once struggling organization expanded its services, offering housing, counseling, and job training to women rebuilding their lives. A plaque honoring Eleanor's memory was placed in the refuge's entryway, ensuring that her kindness would never be forgotten. Agnes visited the refuge often, her heart swelling with pride at the good being done in Eleanor's name. She knew that this outcome was what her dear friend would have wanted, a legacy of compassion and care for others. Agnes occasionally thought of Meredith, wondering if she had found a way to redeem herself. Despite everything, Agnes couldn't help but hope that Meredith might one day learn from her mistakes. For Meredith, redemption was a slow and painful journey. Her first steps came when she mustered the courage to write a letter to the Millhaven Women's Refuge. In it, she expressed her regret for trying to steal her mother's legacy and acknowledged the harm she had caused. Though the letter was brief and clumsy, it was a small but sincere gesture toward making amends. The letter reached Agnes, who read it with a mixture of sadness and hope. She shared it with Mr. Holloway, who agreed that while Meredith had a long way to go, this was a step in the right direction. They chose not to share the letter with the public, protecting Meredith from further humiliation, but they kept it as a reminder that even those who falter can find their way back. Months turned into years, and Meredith continued to rebuild her life. She volunteered at a local food bank, an experience that gave her a new perspective on kindness and humility. Slowly, she began to reconnect with the community, not as Eleanor Wilcox's daughter, but as someone trying to make a positive difference. While Meredith never fully regained the trust of the town, her actions began to speak louder than her past mistakes. And though she would always carry the burden of what she had done, she found solace in the small acts of redemption that now defined her life. As for the town of Millhaven, Eleanor's legacy endured. Her name became synonymous with generosity, and her story served as a reminder of the enduring power of integrity and kindness. In the end, justice had been served, and the community was stronger for it. Eleanor Wilcox's name became a cornerstone of Millhaven's identity in the years following the resolution of her estate. Her selflessness and quiet philanthropy left an indelible mark on the town, amplified by the projects funded through her generosity. The Millhaven Women's Refuge, now thriving thanks to Eleanor's bequest, expanded its reach, offering not just shelter, but hope and empowerment to countless women in need. A garden was planted outside the refuge, lush with wildflowers and fruit trees, and named Eleanor's Haven. It became a place where women and children could find peace, sit under the shade of flowering branches, and feel the warmth of community support. Every year on Eleanor's birthday, the town held a small ceremony in the garden, a gesture of gratitude for the legacy she left behind. Beyond the refuge, Eleanor's estate funded scholarships for local students, many of whom had once doubted their ability to pursue higher education. The town's aging library was also renovated and renamed the Wilcox Memorial Library, its walls adorned with photographs of Eleanor's life, capturing moments of quiet joy and her connection to the community. Residents often said that Eleanor's spirit lingered there, her kindness woven into the very fabric of the town. For Meredith, life after the scandal was not easy. The weight of her actions followed her, a shadow she could not escape. Her fall from grace was a hard pill to swallow, but it forced her to face the person she had become. The anger and entitlement that once fueled her began to ebb, replaced by a slow-burning desire to change. Meredith started small, volunteering at the food bank where she once stood anonymously in line. At first, her presence was met with skepticism. Many in Millhaven had not forgiven her. But over time, as she consistently showed up to help unload deliveries, sort donations, and serve meals, her sincerity began to shine through. She spoke little, her actions doing the heavy lifting. The experience humbled her, showing her the resilience and gratitude of those she once looked down upon. One rainy afternoon, As she wiped down tables at the food bank, Meredith overheard a young woman discussing her plans to apply for a scholarship funded by Eleanor's estate. The girl spoke with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, her voice trembling as she described her dreams of becoming a nurse. For the first time, Meredith felt something she hadn't in years: pride. Not for herself, but for her mother. Eleanor's impact was still rippling through the community, touching lives in ways Meredith had never truly appreciated. That evening, Meredith returned to her modest apartment and sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the letter she'd been drafting for weeks. Addressed to the Millhaven Women's Refuge, it was her way of acknowledging her mother's enduring kindness and apologizing for her own transgressions. She knew it wouldn't erase the past, but it felt like a step toward making peace with herself and the community. Over time, Meredith began to mend some of the bridges she had burned. She approached Agnes one day at the market, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground. "But I want you to know I'm trying to be better, for my mother's sake." Agnes, who had long carried a mixture of disappointment and hope for Meredith, studied her for a moment before offering a nod. "Actions speak louder than words, Meredith. Keep trying." The exchange was brief, but it marked a turning point for Meredith. Slowly, she found ways to honor her mother's legacy, not through grand gestures, but through the small, meaningful actions that had defined Eleanor's life. As the years passed, Meredith's story became one of quiet redemption. Though she would never fully escape the shadow of her greed, she found purpose in helping others. Her journey was far from perfect, but it was a testament to the power of self-reflection and the capacity for change. Millhaven too evolved. The projects funded by Eleanor's estate continued to flourish, knitting the community closer together. The library buzzed with activity, the refuge became a lifeline for women in crisis, and the garden at Eleanor's Haven bloomed brighter each spring. Her memory was not just preserved but actively lived, a constant reminder of the difference one person's kindness could make. On the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's passing, the town gathered in the garden to celebrate her legacy. Meredith stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most, but deeply moved by the speeches and stories shared that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Meredith felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. In the end, Eleanor's life was a testament to the power of integrity and selflessness, and her story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed. Meredith's journey, though fraught with missteps, was a reminder that redemption is possible, even for those who lose their way. Eleanor Wilcox had left more than an estate behind. She had left a legacy of love, resilience, and hope, one that would inspire generations to come. Eleanor's story reminds us of the profound impact one person's kindness and integrity can have, even after they're gone. Her legacy transformed a community, proving that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the lives we touch and the values we uphold. And while Meredith's tale is a cautionary one, it also shows us that even in our darkest moments, there's always room for growth, redemption, and change. What would you do if faced with a situation like Meredith's? Do you think people are capable of true redemption, or is trust lost forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found Eleanor's story as moving as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories like this one.